You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. The Department of Homeland Security may be shifting its approach to deportation flights by ICE. According to reporting by the Washington Post, DHS recently signed a contract to purchase 6 Boeing 737 planes. Currently, ICE primarily uses charter planes for deportations. This purchase suggests the agency has plans to expand its capacity to deport people using its own fleet. What implications does this have for immigration enforcement and the way detainees are moved in and out of the United States? To get some context, we're checking in with Mackenzie Funk. He's a reporter with the nonprofit news organization ProPublica. Mackenzie is based in the Pacific Northwest, and he's covered how these deportation flights have been working. Mackenzie, thank you very much for being here. Welcome.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
So we should be clear, you're not covering the purchase of these planes directly, but you have been covering ICE Air, as it's colloquially known, which refers to this loose network of deportation contractors. And that's what DHS has used during this big ramp up of deportation efforts under President Trump. So what were your immediate thoughts when you heard about the purchase of these 737s?
I had a mixed impression. On the one hand, what I know of ICE Air, which is this charter network, is that it has problems. It's a welter of overlapping jurisdictions. Is it ICE who's in charge or the FAA? It relies on these charter companies who many people have never heard of, who have an older stock of planes, documented mechanical problems. And on the one hand, having a government-run, presumably newer fleet would be good, and also knowing who's in charge. That would be good. On the other hand, what ICE Air charters have is flight attendants, people who have been trained to take care of passengers' safety. And as difficult as that is, even on the existing ICE Air network, without these highly trained flight attendants there to help oversee evacuations and other safety issues, I wonder how it's really going to go on these flights.
I should note that the Washington Post has reported that DHS is not buying the planes directly from Boeing. The DHS contract is with Daedalus Aviation, which was established in February 2024. That's according to corporate records that those reporters dug up. You know, the Department of Homeland Security spokesperson said that this is about saving taxpayer money, Mackenzie, because these deportation flights through contractors, through charter flights, are very expensive. Can you explain your best impression of how that would make sense? Will this actually save money for DHS to operate their own flights?
Well, I'm far from an expert in the pricing that goes into these kind of contracts. But I will point out that this is very surprising for a government that is trying to be smaller to not contract out services like this. And the one benefit of using these charter companies is, one, you can go out to multiple bidders, and two, you can have off days. And we know that immigration numbers have fluctuated. We know that the number of deportation flights have fluctuated. And these charter companies, one day they might be taking Sunseekers to the Caribbean. The next day, they might be doing deportation flights. The next day, they may be taking sports teams to a competition. And they have that flexibility. It's built into their contract. It allows them to maintain as best they can these fleets. It allows them to save costs by sharing it with these private ventures. And so I am skeptical of the figures that DHS has said, we're going to save this much a year. But again, I'm no expert.
Is there a limiting factor that using charter flights has placed on DHS that having its own fleet would lift? I mean, would this purchase allow ICE to potentially ramp up its frequency of deportation flights to the best of what you've discovered in your reporting?
My understanding, and some of this comes from the ICE air monitors at Human Rights First, ICE has absolutely ramped up deportation flights this year, and its reliance on a growing amount of contractors. The one I focused on in my reporting, for the most part, is one called Global Crossing Airlines, or Global X. They're based in Florida, and at this time last year, they were doing about 80% of ICE air deportation flights and these domestic transfer flights. At this point, they are down to about 35% because they brought other contractors in, like Avelo key lime. And another one called Eastern is much more prevalent. They're also relying on Coast Guard flights. As everybody knows, they were using military planes, although I don't think that was ever really a truly big part of the deportations. And so there is, if the bottleneck right now isn't the charter companies, you can see as the administration tries to ramp things up that it could become a bottleneck. Keep in mind, this is the same agency that is out hiring 10,000 new agents. They're on a spending spree uh, thanks to this bill that the Trump administration has passed. And buying airplanes could, if they were able to ramp up to the numbers they want, 1 million deportations a year, you could see, even if it's not the bottleneck now, it could become one.
And we should note that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that spending bill that was passed earlier this year, allocated 170 billion to immigration enforcement over 4 years. So, as you say, there has been a ramp up of spending along with these ambitions to deport more people from the United States. There were 1,700 deportation flights to 77 countries from January 20th, when Trump took office, to October 31st. That's according to that ICE Flight Monitor Human Rights First organization that you mentioned. I know that you've been reporting on specifically certain charter companies and the experiences of crew members on board. Many of them had safety concerns that they shared with you. What did you hear about what goes on these flights, and especially how migrants who are being deported are treated?
Well, the flight attendants I talked to, 7 in all, most of whom decided to remain anonymous or use a nickname, they reported a pretty consistent set of things. One of them is that they were required by the FAA to be on board because they've had that safety training, but they were not really allowed to interact with the detainees, which many of them thought was quite inhumane. They weren't allowed to bring them water. If a detainee looked at them, they were instructed to look out the window. But so there was the inhumanity is the word some of them used. There was that, but there was also the fact that the guards didn't listen to them, because there are flight attendants on board, and then there are about a dozen contracted guards who work for a contractor called Acoma. And then there is usually one or maybe two actual ICE employees overseeing the operation. And it was never clear to them in crisis or just in daily operations, where does the buck stop beyond the captain and the pilot and co-pilot? But between the flight attendants and the guards, the flight attendants who were required by the FAA to oversee evacuations and make sure people aren't standing up during takeoff or landing, have their seatbelts on, have their luggage stowed. These things that matter, that we've studied for years, and that are really important for passenger safety, that was never clear. And beyond that issue, there's the simple fact that detainees, most of them, are in shackles. They have a chain around their waist. They have handcuffs on. They have ankle shackles, and the handcuffs and ankle shackles are then chained to that waist chain. They shuffle along when they climb up into the airplane. They shuffle along down to their seat. The idea that these people could evacuate without major assistance was laughable or deeply scary to the flight attendants I talked to. They said there's no way. The FAA has a standard for manufacturing of these commercial carriers, and that is that any plane that's flying in our skies should be able to be evacuated within 90 seconds. And they said 90 seconds to get 100 people in shackles out, people who are shuffling along, who can't jump down the slides, who could pop the slides. It was a nightmare, and it did keep some of them up at night.
Do we know how many, say on a deportation flight of 100 people, would have been convicted of serious crimes? Or is there any way to get that kind of data?
On a given flight, it is more difficult, but we do know that by and large, both under Biden and now increasingly under Trump, the people being arrested and put into immigration detention do not have serious criminal records. That has always been the case. But many don't have criminal records at all, and the portion who've had violent criminal histories is quite small. We're talking single digit percentage on, and most likely that's true across the flights as well. So the flight attendants were aware these are not dangerous criminals by any means. These are people who, in many cases, they had a civil immigration violation. They perhaps overstayed a visa. Maybe they came illegally but then stayed on. Or they crossed the border, which is equivalent to a traffic ticket.
In your reporting from last year, you have called the observation room at Boeing Field arguably America's best real-time window into our vast network of privately run deportation flights. And this is something that's come to light, again, because of nonprofits and researchers at the University of Washington and others who have highlighted that this is going on just in Seattle's backyard. Can you talk about how that program works and what we've been able to learn about the deportation process?
Yeah, it's interesting how much of what we know about ICE Air and these deportation flights in general comes from Washington State. And it's because the Center for Human Rights at the University of Washington decided, I believe in 2018, to try to understand if King County, which Boeing Field is part of, was keeping in line with the state and its own stated sanctuary policies. And so they tried to understand, is the county helping? But as they started digging, they got more and more information about this network of charter companies, including the charter companies' names, eventually these reports about any crashes they've had and other serious incidents like that. And so that trove ended up in a series of reports from the University of Washington, and then became the basis for the flight monitor we were speaking about before, and eventually is the reason that King County allowed observers to set up a video feed, or rather set up a video feed for observers at Boeing Field. And a couple years ago, you had to go to Boeing Field, go into this conference room, and you could see a live stream of the plane's landing. And these flight monitors from a variety of local activist and nonprofit groups would come in and they would simply count. They would count how many men and women on, how many men and women off. They would watch the buses come and go. They would note the frequency of the flights, typically for a time they were on Tuesdays. And that was helpful in the sense that we could get an idea of the cadence of these things at a sort of under the Biden baseline, and did feed into efforts made by others. After the University of Washington's reports, it did become a lot harder for amateur flight trackers to track these flights going on, just to know where they were going and how they were doing it.
Why?
It's a bit obscure, but they were filing flight numbers with a certain code that was a code for this is a deportation flight. And so it was really as simple as looking at the code on the flight in the flight logs. And that became a little bit more difficult. Most recently, some of the airplanes have turned off their trackers entirely. So it's not just they're changing the flight code, but the planes themselves don't have their transponders on some of these flights. And so there have been various steps to obscure all of this after the University of Washington came out with that. And so the flight trackers were trying to just get eyeballs on it. And what's happened now is King County is not only still streaming that video, you could go down to Boeing Field and watch it, but it's visible online. You can go to a video feed in real time and watch these flights go on. And it's people are tuning in nationally and watching what happens. One thing I saw last year was a man being loaded in what appears to be a full body restraint called the wrap. There's been some reporting over the years that ICE uses these restraints to, of course, keep people from doing dangerous things, but also as a punishment. And the wrap, it looks like a mix between a sleeping bag and a straitjacket. And you can watch in the video I've seen, you watch them take this man and walk him up the steps. The flight attendants I talked to, one of them called it being burritoed, and he said it happened. And I asked people, well, how would you get someone in the wrap off a plane. Shackles are bad enough, and none of them had any idea how you would do that.
And I just want to underline that all of this is the work of independent organizations, research at the University of Washington. This is not transparency that was readily available on a federal government operation. Before we go here, Mackenzie, I've got a lot of ongoing questions about how DHS will operate a fleet of its own planes, the kinds of FAA regulations that are involved, the mechanical upkeep, the cost of that, having flight crews that are trained in all of these ways that we've talked about, the flight attendants who are really there to evacuate people. I also wonder what this means for the future plans to further ramp up immigration enforcement, including against people who don't have criminal records. I mean, what are the questions that remain for you when you hear that DHS has purchased 6 737s? What ongoing questions do you have about this story?
The biggest question I have is based on the fact that we know what's happened with some of the new hires ICE has brought in just as its daily immigration enforcement officers. They have accelerated the training program for federal officers, which happens at a place called FLETC in Georgia. It's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers. They have accelerated the training program. They have brought on new recruits who have flunked a lot of the physical tests. This is based on other reporting, not on my own. And they have generally tried to rush in these 10,000 new hires. If that's the pattern with their deportation officers, I have great concerns that they aren't going to take the care to train these in-flight officers or the in-flight guards in the way that FAA-approved flight attendants have been trained. And it's intense. The flight attendants I talk to, they talk about daily tests. You've got to hit certain percentages, 90%, or you have to retake the test. Fail too many times, you're out. You have to go down the slides. They have to practice all the yelling to all the door drills. And will ICE train its guards up to that standard so that they can evacuate the detainees? That's an open question, and I think it's the one that I'll be focused on in the coming months.
Mackenzie Funk is a reporter for ProPublica. He's been covering ICE Air, the network of charter companies that ICE has been using for deportation. And I've been talking with him about the purchase of 6 737s by DHS that has been coming to light because of Washington Post reporting. Mackenzie, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.